Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting TIES webinar. That's the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. I am Penny Coogan, the Center for Inquiry Education Coordinator, and joining us today is Andrew Hipp. We're going to be learning about oak trees, and two lucky teachers are going to get a copy of the book sent directly to their house. So we're going to make that announcement and a few other announcements at the end. But thank you to everyone who is attending this live. And if you have questions for Andrew, type them into the chat box below, and I will read the best questions to him at the end of his presentation. And with that, thank you so much, Andrew, and we are excited to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here and see so many friends and new folks whom I don't know in the audience. Anyway, I'm here to talk to you today about oaks. Oak Origins is a book that I wrote, my wife illustrated, and we just published this past year. And it's really about these magnificent organisms that we've come to love. And it's easy to say what an oak tree is if we sort of think of characteristics. Oaks are wood plants. We've got giant trees like bur oaks. We have shrubs that may be no more than ankle high, like this Quercus striatula, which I've seen in Durango and Tamaulipas. They have clustered end buds, like these black oak, Quercus velutina end buds, where you get the buds of the new twigs are clustered at the end, very typical in oaks. And they are wind pollinated. So when you go out in the spring and see oaks flowering, you see these dangling catkins or aments that are just filled with pollen. And of course, oaks have acorns, these characteristic fruits with little caps on the top. You get these combination of characters no matter where you are in the world, you're looking at an oak. But oaks are much more than just these characteristics that define them. They're individuals, they are species, and they're a bough on the great tree of life that connects all living things, going back to the dawn of life roughly 3.8 billion years ago. We can understand oaks best, any organisms, if we think of them from all of these angles. This book, Oak Origins, is a portrait of oaks from all three angles. It's written by myself, Andrew Hipp, the bald one in this photo, and illustrated by my wife, Rachel Davis, the pretty one in this photo. It arises from our complementary interests in natural history, biodiversity, and understanding the natural world. So what you're looking at here is the table of contents. This is a 7-chapter book, and it runs from an understanding of individuals as oaks as individuals, goes on to discuss oaks as populations and species, then goes on to talk about them as branches on the tree of life. These are the three views that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. What we won't be talking about as much is oaks as the foundations of the forest. The 7th chapter of the book is about oaks and their interactions with fungi, with insects, with birds. We'll get to some of that in the very beginning of the talk, but there's a lot more in the 7th chapter. And oaks as genomic entities. There's a wonderful body of genomic research. A lot of my work is in that area. We're not going to be focused on that in the talk just for lack of time. It's super exciting stuff. So let's start with oaks as individuals. Here we're really talking about reproduction and dispersal, starting in March, April, when the buds begin to open, depending on where you are. And as the oak buds open, the leaves come out of the buds, and alongside them out come the male flowers on catkins. Catkins are these elongated structures that come out of the basal scales of the end buds. As they come out, they stretch, and you begin to see the individual flowers. Each individual male flower is really just like a bouquet of stamens. These look like hot dog buns that are fused together lengthwise. Those are the anthers. Each anther then goes together into a group to make one staminate flower called staminate. That's the male flower because it's filled with stamens. And the stamens are the anthers plus the filaments that hold them to the flower. When you put all these together on these long stalks, those long stalked structures with all the individual male flowers on them, those are called catkins or aments. Very distinctive. Just hide this so you can see. Inside each pollen sac, these 4 cavities that are within each anther, you get hundreds to thousands of mother cells that are undergoing meiosis. This is a 2-phased cell replication, DNA replication, and cell division process that may produce anywhere from 1,700 to 7,300 pollen grains in a single anther. We don't have a great count on this. There's not a lot of studies across species, mainly because people don't want to count all those little pollen grains. This is an estimate from just a few Iberian oaks. At maturity, the anthers crack open and outpour the pollen grains. Here you see some anthers that are collected from a white oak that Mira Gardner, who's on this call right now, and I collected at the Morton Arboretum in 2017 as part of a very large project. You'll see some of Mira's work later in this talk. When the anthers crack open, if the air is not too humid, right, the pollen goes flying. If you get low humidity and warm days, there's pollen everywhere. If the air is too humid, though, more than about 60% humidity, all those pollen grains become sticky. They glob together, and you get anthers all over the trail. So you get ill-timed rain can kill reproduction. If the humidity is low, the anthers empty out in hours to a few days. So what we're looking at here, just to orient you again, this is what you would see under a hand lens. If you had a magnifying glass and you're looking at one flower, there's the anther with pollen grains coming out of the side. It's attached to the flower by a filament. Pollen grains spill out of the side, and then that whole thing together is called the stamen. Okay, so that's the male flowers. Meanwhile, the stigmas of the pistillate or female flowers become receptive just in time to catch the pollen. So what we're looking at here, these things that look like little baby acorns, these are the pistillate flowers. Each one has 3 stigmatic lobes at the tip. When they come out fresh and pink to reddish, they're nice and sticky, they're receptive, so that pollen that's flying on the wind can stick on the surface of that stigma. If the pollen grains survive the voyage, and the vast majority of them don't, right? Each anther sending out thousands and thousands of pollen grains. They're smashing into the sides of cars. They're falling in the grass. They're getting stuck in wet paint. They're all over the place, everywhere but the flowers. But every few of them will land on a stigma and be able to germinate. And if they land on a receptive stigma from the right species, they'll germinate almost immediately. What we're looking at here is a developmental series of female flowers on Quercus acutissima. This is it's the sawtooth oak. Super beautiful paper by my colleague Min Deng. And what you're seeing here's the receptive stigmas. And as they open up, what's happening is that the pollen grain has landed right here on the stigma, and it's grown a tube down to the ovules. So if you can see my arrow right down here, we're looking at a cross section through a flower. Those pollen tubes grow down like this, and they get to the base of the style. Those pollen tubes will sit down there for weeks to months before they're allowed to then get all the way through and pollinate or fertilize one of these ovules. Every pistillate flower starts out with 6 ovules. And usually, once one of them is fertilized, all the others are aborted. So you typically, as you open an acorn, if you've ever cut open an acorn, you'll only find a single seed inside most of the time. But every once in a while, you get a 2-seeded acorn, like this one that I found in Maple Grove Forest Preserve. I think this was last year. It was earlier this year. This is a Quercus alba, an eastern white oak seedling that was growing at the edge of the trail. And I looked at it closely. I thought, something's goofy about this. It looked like it had 4 seed leaves. These thick, meaty things are called cotyledons. These are the seed leaves that grow inside the acorn. They're packed full of food for the baby oak. But when I opened them up, what I could see is that it was actually 2 seedlings that had grown together inside one acorn. there's a little bit of research on this. It turns out that when this happens, those two seedlings don't do so well because they're competing for resources. They grow up a little bit more slowly. So the mom's job, the mama tree's job, is to get all this nutrients into the seed to feed her baby plants, right? But she's also doing something else. She wants seed dispersers like blue jays, like squirrels, to take the acorns and plant them on her behalf. So acorns want to lure the seed dispersers by putting food in there for the seed dispersers, but they want to leave enough food that their offspring get into the next generation. So the acorns are defended. So they're not a perfect food resource. They're packed full of tannins, which are a chemical that we tan leather with, that you can make ink out of. If you've ever tasted a raw acorn, the vast majority of acorns are really awful to eat. They are terribly bitter. That's the tannins you're tasting. The shells are thick to keep weevils out, not completely successful. The plants will relocate nutrients into the roots when they start growing, where they're less accessible. They'll move those cotyledons, those big, thick seed leaves, away from the seedlings as they grow. They'll tolerate some amount of herbivory. And finally, they'll produce tons and tons of seeds in some years, but not all. So many that the oaks will actually saturate the herbivores, so they can't all eat. So let's look at each of these in turn. So tannins, the chemical defense, this is a chemical that binds to proteins. And so tannins take proteins that are in the acorn and make it relatively inaccessible if that's all that an animal eats. So this is an interesting study that was done on mice. I don't know what this mouse species is. It's a East Asian mouse species, I believe. They fed a group of mice only acorns, and one group they didn't acclimate at all, so they just started feeding them acorns cold. And these mice did not succeed. They lost weight over time. So just eating acorns, they lose weight. Whereas the acclimated ones actually didn't lose weight, but on average, they also didn't gain weight. No organism can live on acorns only, at least no vertebrates, including even acorn woodpeckers. You may have heard about this acorn woodpecker that hid 700 pounds of acorns in the wall of a home in California, despite the fact that they rely on acorns to get their young into the next generation. Not even the acorn woodpeckers can survive on acorns alone. So acorns don't have tannins all the way through at an even rate. What the tree does is it actually increases the tannin concentration at the apex where the growing tips are, because this is the most vulnerable area. So herbivores that come along and find an acorn will find that the very tips where the growing tips are full of tannins and less desirable. But the bases underneath the caps are filled with lipids, the fats that are more desirable to the squirrels, to the mice, to the weevils, to the birds who want to eat the acorns. Okay, now they've got all these tannins in there. That's not going to stop every acorn disperser, right? So white oak acorns and probably many other species shunt nutrients into the roots rapidly as they begin germinating. So what we've got here is, so for instance, this is Quercus virginiana. I don't remember which species this is, but what you see is as the root grows out of the acorn, it quickly starts to pull the nutrients out of the cotyledons, which are these guys right here. And in the roots, those resources are a lot less digestible by the mice, by the squirrels, by anybody who would want them. So it's a way of protecting those nutrients right away. Third trick, acorns, as they grow, push the cotyledons away from the growing seedling. So that the seedling begins to grow, these cotyledons still have a little nutrition in them. If a mouse comes along and starts to devour or just take the cotyledons away, the seedling will grow just fine because they're separated from the cotyledons by these petioles, by these stalks. Acorns, moreover, can tolerate a bit of herbivory. So this, for instance, is an illustration of Quercus insignis, the largest acorns in the world. They're about this size. They grow in the cloud forests of Mexico and Central America. If those are eaten, even a third of them are eaten, a third of that mass is eaten, that acorn will still germinate just fine. So the tree has built in more food than it even needs. And some of the plants do an even more interesting thing. They'll embed the seedling that's at the very tip of the acorn deep into the cotyledons. And this is because, this is because squirrels know enough that they know that some of the acorns that they're going to want to cache or hide in the ground germinate readily. So the white oak acorns, for instance, begin to germinate right away when they're hidden in the ground, or if you even find them on the trail. So what squirrels will do is they will nibble away the very tip of the acorn to keep it from germinating. Quercus mongolica, however, has evolved a way of avoiding this problem. If a squirrel nips away the tip, that Quercus mongolica acorn can still germinate just fine. So the squirrels and the trees really work together to decide where trees are going to be planted in the forest. And the squirrels have become very clever, right? They move around the forest. They may move acorns 50, 100 meters in a given generation. And they've become adept at figuring out which acorns are best for them. So when a squirrel finds an acorn, it'll grab that acorn in its hands. It'll rotate it around like this. That rotation of the acorn tells it, okay, is it rotten on one side? Just like if you picked up a grapefruit and it was half of it was rotten, you would be able to feel that it was uneven. So they rotate it around, and then they'll take that acorn in their teeth and they'll shake it like that. A very low mass acorn that's been devoured by weevils will shake very easily. A heavy mass one won't. So they do all these things to assess the quality, assess the weight. If the quality is very low, they may ditch it or they may eat it right away. And if it's very high and likely to germinate, they may nip the tip off so that it doesn't germinate in the cache. In fact, squirrels have become very good taxonomists, relatively good taxonomists. They know the distinctions between the red oaks and the white oaks. And the reason is the white oaks tend to germinate in the same year in which they fall. If any of you are from the upper Midwest or Eastern North America, you may see in a given year when there's lots and lots of Eastern white oak acorns on the trails, those roots come out right away out of the tip of the acorn. Whereas the red oaks wait through the winter. If you're looking at bur oak, you look at bur oak in the northern part of its range, it will tend to go through winter dormancy without germinating, whereas bur oak in the southern part of its range will tend to germinate in the same fall when those seeds are dropped. Because the white oaks, when they germinate, pull nutrients out of the cotyledons, they become a poor food resource for the squirrels. So the squirrels know to eat the white oaks right away or nip the tips off of them so that they don't germinate in the cache. The red oaks, they tend to disperse and cache because the red oaks are less likely to germinate. And in the middle of winter, when the squirrels are hungry, they can go looking for their acorns, and they find many of them. Now, jays are even better acorn dispersers. Blue jays, gray jays, Mexican jays, they regularly cache their acorns more than 1 kilometer from their home tree. They almost always bury acorns, which means that they're less likely to dry out, less likely to be eaten by other other herbivores, and they relocate acorns to where they will thrive, often in relatively sunny conditions. And Leah Garner is here. So wherever you go in the world, where there's oaks, you tend to find jays. Jays disperse differently than squirrels do, of course. They pick acorns one by one. They'll pull them from the tree. They'll stuff a few of them into their mouths, take one in the tip of their bill, and fly along. And then they'll bury them individually in the ground, hammering them into the ground, a little bit like you may have seen gray squirrels do, where they hammer the acorn into the ground. This habit is called scatter hoarding. So jays and squirrels scatterherd. They move acorns individually around the landscape instead of piling them up all into one big pile. If you draw a map of jays and a map of oaks worldwide, those maps roughly overlap. Quercus being oaks, Pinus being pines, and here's several of the jays and their relatives worldwide. Because the jays and the oaks and pines depend on each other, they tend to co-vary. Okay, so those are all individual interactions between acorns and seed dispersers and potential herbivores. But acorns don't depend just on individual defenses. Every few years, they mass, they produce tons and tons of acorns. And in those years, you find lots of seedlings because they've saturated the markets. They've given the acorn eaters more than they can possibly eat. This is a photo of Quercus robur in northern France, the densest stand of oak seedlings I've ever seen. It was like a lawn of oaks. But we find these in our area too. So this fall, late October, we see Quercus alba seedlings, these green guys. You see them in the understory here, running around with the sugar maple seedlings. These are left over from last year's mast, when the white oaks produced tons of acorns, far more than the squirrels could eat. So what causes this? It turns out there's a few things governing masting. Sometimes it's the amount of pollen. Sometimes it's the synchrony of flowering. And sometimes it's how much flowering intensity there is. And this depends on which species you're looking at, and sometimes even which population you're looking at within a given species. What drives it? It's weather. Early springs, warm springs can increase pollen production, flowering intensity, and pollen synchrony. Lower temperatures can reduce all of these. A midsummer drought can veto flowering. When you put all these things together, what you get is a production of seeds that tends to be very erratic, something that squirrels and jays can't predict. So as a consequence, in a year when there's a lot of acorn production, the squirrels and other seed herbivores like the deer mice, they do very well, right? They have a lot of acorns to eat, and so their populations tend to rise. And with those rising populations, you tend to get lots of, in our area, deer ticks. And with the deer ticks, Lyme's disease. So it turns out that the best predictor of Lyme's disease is mast years, where a couple of years after a mast year, you see an uptick in incidence of Lyme disease. Not a reason to dislike oaks, but a good reason to wear tick repellent. So what we see then, what we're seeing here is seedlings, these plus signs in two species in one European forest. This aggregation of seedlings here in the sessile oak, and to a lesser extent in the pedunculate oak. These are results of mast years. Those mast years saturate the market. They get a lot of acorns out there. You produce these lawns of seedlings. Those provide the environments in which natural selection can weed out the less successful seedlings and encourage the ones and allow the ones that are doing well to really take off. So that in a given cohort, by age 12, typically only about 5% of the seedlings in a given cohort survive, right? That's an immense amount of natural selection. And that natural selection is improving populations. So they're tuned to their environments. They fit their environments better and better. So dispersal then, this business of reproducing and getting seeds out into the next generation in places where they'll survive, is a balance between provisioning acorns with food for the next generation and manipulating the seed dispersers, particularly the squirrels and the jays, who will then plant the trees. And so squirrels and jays really, without intending to, they're gardening the oak forest for us, but oaks are guiding their work. Okay, so now that's oaks as individuals. Let's begin to think now about oaks as populations and species. Because these individual level processes that we look at, pollination, reproduction, seed dispersal, establishment, inheritance of traits, survival, you put all these things together and you get a population or a species. So when we think of species, it's very natural to think of them in terms of reproduction, which is how probably most of us learned about species. A lot of us learned about the biological species concept in high school. That's the story I at least learned, and I know from talking to people, a lot of other folks are in this boat. We learned that horses and donkeys are different species because when they breed, their offspring is sterile. That's the mule, right? So the sterility of the mule, we say, must be proof that a horse and donkey are separate species. And this is an idea that came from it's kind of a well, it's kind of a simplification of an idea, the biological species concept that was introduced by Ernst Mayr and Theodosius Dobzhansky. These are wonderful books if you're interested in this stuff, well worth reading. But the thing about it is that's too simple a story. The mule isn't actually completely sterile. It's been known since before Aristotle that mules will give birth once in a while. And in fact, we see gene flow across the tree of life, hybridization between different species. So reproduction, right, it's hard to quantify in practice. It's hard to know what reproductive boundaries, how much is enough to make a species. And we rarely witness reproduction directly. When we talk about species, we're generally thinking of entities that are morphologically and ecologically distinct. So here we're looking at just some leaf traits. These numbers are abstract numbers representing differences between Quercus petraea, Quercus robur. These are two European species, the sessile oak and the pedunculate oak. But then some of them are intermediate. Those represent hybrids because not everything we see in the world, especially in oaks, is readily classified as one species or the other. Hybridization belies the idea that reproduction alone can define species. So in the 18th and 19th century, tree hybrids were really well known, but their importance in wild populations was contentious. There's all this work on some oaks found along the Schuylkill River. These are called Bartram's oaks. And people studied these. There's a whole story to be told there that's kind of fascinating. But the Bartram oak became kind of a lightning rod for this discussion of whether or not hybrids could be real in natural populations. So much so that some argued that if there were actually hybrids in natural populations, this would mean that the number of oak species in our forests would be innumerable, right? But in fact, we know there's roughly 90 species in North America, in the US, in North America, North Mexico, not bajillions. So what's going on? So experimental crosses in the early 1900s demonstrated that hybridization was really going on in wild populations, and this has continued to be demonstrated in the current day using genomic methods. So by the middle of the 20th century, people had shifted away from thinking about just hybridization to beginning to think about like, okay, well, what happens since we know that hybridization is going on? What does it do for the species? What we have here is a really nice illustration from Edgar Anderson talking about work that he was doing at the time, saying, okay, we have species A here, species B here. Things that look intermediate between them, those are probably hybrids, right? Between species A and species B. But what about when those hybrids are not reproductively isolated, when they're not sterile, and they can reproduce with one or the other parents? What we get is a movement of genes between species. This is called intergression. And this movement of genes between two species can really influence the evolution of those two species. Really cool early study by G. Ledyard Stebbins showed that in blackjack oak, Quercus marylandica, and bear oak, Quercus ilicifolia, when they're growing separately, He sampled them from herbarium samples. There's some statistical issues with this approach, but it was correct, even though it was a biased study. As far as we could tell, it was correct. He said when they were growing separately in different areas, they were morphologically very distinct. So what we see is some morphological characters here that separate Ilicifolia bare oak from Marylandica blackjack oak. When blackjack oak was growing alone in a natural population, it was really distinctive. But when they're growing together in one population, sympatric, sim for together, Patrick, same, Patrick for the countries that are living together in the same county right there, they appeared more similar to one another, suggesting that genes are moving between species, despite the fact that after over 200 generations of living together at the same site, those two species were still identifiable and distinct. So this suggests that gene flow was the first study to really suggest, as later studies would go on to show, like this beautiful work in Quercus in red oak and Hills oak by Oliver Gehling and colleagues, that when species grow together, they can exchange genes, and those genes can really influence how they grow and who survives. So data that we know that we have today show us that traditional oak species are distinct ecologically and morphologically, but they still exchange genes. In fact, the diversity of oaks is so high in many areas that it's hard to talk about two-species hybrids in oaks. Multi-species hybridization is probably the rule. So here we're looking at the number of oak species per region, and you find there's areas with 25 or more oak species growing together in a fairly small area. And in these areas, hybridization is, the opportunities for hybridization and exchange of genes is super high. So this was realized and kind of came to a head in the 1970s. People had given up on the idea of very simple sort of classic biological species concepts that were defined strictly by reproductive isolation. And so James Harden in 1975, he did this beautiful illustration of the 16 approximately Eastern North American white oak species with lines between them demonstrating some hybridization that was known between those two species. And what he showed is that morphologically and ecologically, almost all of the species were entangled with at least one other species, yet they were still retaining their distinctions in the wild. Following up on this, Bill Berger, same year, published a paper based on his graduate work on bur oak, arguing that if we take the biological species concept at its word and we focus on reproductive isolation as defining species, that we're going to have in North America two species, basically, the white oak species and the red oak species. So that's deeply dissatisfying because when we go out there ecologically, morphologically, we can see multiple things. Almost anybody in this audience probably knows a half a dozen oak species in their area. Species, he said then, are adapted to a unique niche, and they share the broader evolutionary advances of their close relatives through gene flow. In other words, Bill Berger was saying species are evolving ecologically to a specific place, but they're exchanging the genes that allow them to survive in that environment with their close relatives. And this idea was further refined by Lee Van Valen at University of Chicago a year later, who concluded that it might well be that genes are not even a meaningful way to circumscribe species. And he argued that it could well be that Quercus macrocarpa, bur oak, in Quebec exchanges more genes with local Quercus bicolor, that's swamp white oak, than it does with bur oak in Texas. So by the 1970s, people were sort of hard-pressed to answer the very basic question, what is an oak species? But we knew they were out there. So things got easier when we had molecules to look at, really beginning in the 1990s. So the very first DNA-based oak studies used chloroplast data. This is really great work by Alan Whittemore, who was, he ran the U.S. National Arboretum Herbarium for over 20 years and is now a research affiliate in our herbarium at the Morton Arboretum, and a great friend and colleague, wonderful thinker, and was the first one to study chloroplast DNA in oaks. And he found exactly what Lee Van Valen said he would find, which is when he looked at a site like San Jacinto, Madison, and Houston counties, Texas, he found that white oak, swamp chestnut oak, bur oak all had the same chloroplast type. That when he went to Greene County, Wisconsin, white oak and bur oak had the same chloroplast type. That he went to Travis County, Texas, he found that post oak and Quercus virginiana, the southern live oak, had the same chloroplast type. If there was no reproduction between species, you would expect that each of these lines of this phylogenetic tree would be one species, and that species would be separated from each other. Instead, what he found is that regions were separated from each other in the chloroplast. This was found even more dramatically by European workers when they were looking at the European white oaks. So they looked at, here we're looking at just a snapshot of a portion of France where they had done a lot of genotyping of 4 species. This is pedunculate oak, sessile oak, Quercus pubescens, and Quercus pyrenaica. And again, if there was no gene flow between these species, no hybridization, if they were reproductively isolated from each other, what you would expect is that these colors, each of them representing a different chloroplast type, a gray chloroplast type, a black chloroplast type, just representing them, a hash marked, a white, that each species would have its own chloroplast type. But no, instead, each region, the western region, mostly gray, the eastern region, mostly black. The fact that the chloroplasts are being shared among species so much that regions are defined by a chloroplast type instead of species being defined by a chloroplast type. So here we are in the 90s, and we've got all this chloroplast data saying genes are being exchanged between oaks so wildly. It raises the question still, is there a genetic way of identifying species? Fortunately, going back to Allen's 1991 paper with Barbara Schall, he was doing a postdoc with her at the time, what they found was that if you looked at the nuclear data, that we have in our bodies multiple genomes. We have a mitochondrial genome and a nuclear genome. Plants have a chloroplast genome, a mitochondrial genome, and a nuclear genome. Suffice it to say, the nuclear genome is carried by the pollen and the seeds. The chloroplast is only carried by the seeds, so it doesn't go as far. When they looked at the nuclear genome, what they found is that white oaks and bur oaks had one nuclear genome type, and post oaks had another altogether. So this suggested that there was some reproductive isolation between at least Quercus stellata and Macrocarpa and alba that wasn't reflected in the chloroplast. It turns out, with more work on this, that is a universal story, that genomes with high intraspecific gene flow, the pollen moving between trees, pollen can fly 30 to 80 kilometers and successfully pollinate a tree. The lion's share of it only goes 100, 200 meters, but there's an awful high opportunity for long distance gene flow, whereas acorns rarely go more than a kilometer or 2 in a given generation. These high rates of gene flow in the nucleus allow the individual populations that make a species to cohere genetically, even while they're swapping genes with other species. Okay, let me show you an example from some work that was done by Mira Garner, who's in the audience right now. Hello, Mira. So as an example, let's look back at the white oak syngamion. This is the group of interbreeding species that James Harden, Bill Berger, Lee Van Valen investigated. So we have post oak, Quercus stellata, white oak, Quercus alba, bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa, swamp white oak, Quercus bicolor. We have mountain chestnut oak, Quercus montana. We have swamp chestnut oak, Quercus michoii. We have Quercus muhlenbergii and prinoides. That's chinkapin, dwarf chinkapin. We can't separate them genetically, so we're leaving them together for this talk. So Mira traveled around the United States, did this heroic trip in 2017, working with Sarah Desmond, who was her research intern that summer. They collected from the lion's share of these populations, collected bur oaks to do genetic data on. And everywhere that they found bur oaks, they also collected any co-occurring species with which the bur oaks might hybridize. That includes white oaks, that includes chinkapin, that includes swamp white oak, that includes post oak. Mira did some genotypic work, and when she analyzed the genomic work, the genotypic work, what she found is that the white oak species cluster genetically. What we're looking at here, this is called an ordination. If you haven't seen one before, you take all the genetic data that you have for a bunch of individuals, and you ask how distant are these individuals genetically? And then you say, well, let me take all these distances, let me squash them into 2 dimensions. And once you do that, points that are close to each other, individual trees, are genetically similar to each other. Points that are distant from each other are genetically dissimilar. You see that there's like a group of post oak. There's a group up here of chinkapin oak. There's a group right in the middle of white oak. The fact that species cluster like this in space, in genomic space, shows us that genetically they're distinct. Just as much as when we walk around and we look at these, I can recognize a goat oak and a white oak. You can as well. Sometimes we're confused, but for the most part, we can tell these things apart. Just as they're phenotypically in appearance, ecologically, where we find them growing on the landscape, they're also genotypically distinct from one another. Yet, even with these data, which this data happened to just be a little sparse snippet, we found these lines of connection between species, suggesting that while these species are all distinct from one another genomically, they are exchanging genes at a low rate in spite of their distinctness on the landscape. So Bill Berger had this argument, right, that oak species are evolving in a specific niche, right, but then swapping genes that allow them to survive in those niches. So they're playing both games at once. They're solving ecological problems and then gathering solutions to ecological problems from other species that they can hybridize with. He was absolutely right. Oaks are doing both things at once. Now, when you put this stuff all together, you put reproduction and species together, you get the tree of life. And this is the last section of our talk. We're at about 15 minutes. So we'll get on through and think about what the world looked like before oaks. Oaks evolved in a tropical world. This is what Antarctica looked like, a section of Antarctica, at about 86 million years ago, when the ancestors to the oaks, the oak genus hadn't evolved yet, but are just getting their start in the world. Well, we know what happened next. At 65 million years ago, an asteroid smashes into the globe, right? Dinosaurs go extinct. There's a big reshuffling of mammals. Mammals come into their sort of gain their ascendancy. There's a reshuffling of the flora. And this long twilight that resulted, we get this smash right here, asteroid hitting the Earth. It got very cold for a period of months to years. This was a hard time to be an evergreen tree, but it may have given deciduous trees a toehold, an opportunity for oaks to get their way in the world. And it also marks a step toward the evolution of acorns. Because it's 65 million years ago, right there where that red line goes, that's when the big nutted members of the oak family evolved. What we're looking at here is a phylogeny. You won't see a lot of these in this talk, but a few of them. Each of these nodes represents an ancestor. Down here, you see how old they are. What you see is that at 65 million years ago, the ancestor of this group right here evolved. These are all the oak family members that have big fruited fruits. They produce nuts like Castanopsis, Chrysolepis, Notholithocarpus, the oaks themselves. And of course, the acorns. Acorns that we find growing on the forest floor would have thrived in this environment. So oaks evolved at about 56 million years ago into this tropical world. Temperatures were rising, and oaks are in their infancy as temperatures reach a record high, well, about 12 degrees above what our global temperature is right now. And they were evolving far on the north. Our earliest oak fossils are in the northern portions of the temperate zone. It seems very likely that the ancestral oak was a population straddling the northern continents. And the reason for that is when you look at the oak phylogeny, the evolutionary history of oaks, you find two main lineages. One of them is called subgenus Ceres. It is limited to Western Europe and East Asia. And the other lineage, or clade, that we call Quercus, subgenus Quercus, that includes the white oaks, that includes the red oaks, that includes the intermediate oaks, the southern live oaks. That's almost exclusive to North America. A lineage of white oaks did eventually spread over to Eastern North America, to Eurasia from Eastern North America about 20 million years ago, but we'll come back to that story in just a second. So North America was really this early success story, and it continues to be. The earliest known white oak fossil is known here from 45 million years ago. The earliest known red oak from right here at 48 million years ago. So within the first few million years of oak evolution, these major groups, the white oaks, the red oaks, and all the other groupings of oaks had separated out from each other. They didn't look like today's species. Lobed species wouldn't even evolve until for another 20 million years or so. So they're up here in the north. And as oaks are diversifying, temperatures are cooling and drying. The climate is drying. So oaks begin to disperse south. As the temperatures cool, North America is filled with a broad-leaved evergreen forest. Those evergreen forests are pinched up against the Gulf of Mexico. They're squeezed down into Mexico, and temperatures just keep dropping. And oak species with lobed leaves spread across the continent. So by 23 million years ago, the American oak clades and other temperate forest species had mostly reached their maximum extent. So if you come here 23 million years ago into Eastern North America, you would have seen ancestral white oaks, ancestral red oaks had diversified in Eastern North America and California, moving southward. And really, we'd see a lot of the diversity that we see in today's forests in Eastern North America and California, but not yet in Mexico or in Eurasia, because oaks were double dipping sort of as they evolved through the Americas, the red oaks and the white oaks, clades evolving in the same geographic regions and in the same ecosystems, producing the diversity that we observe today. Now, okay, so that's North America by 23 million years ago. But two exciting things happened between about 23 and 20 million years ago. At the north end of the continent, one population of white oaks moved back to Eurasia, either east across the North Atlantic land bridge, some molecular data suggest that, or west across the Bering land bridge, some fossil data suggest that. This population would found the Eurasian white oaks. And when it got over there, the white oak group had to duke it out with the ring-cupped oaks of Southeast Asia, with the cork oaks that were by this time in East Asia and Europe, and the holly oaks, which were doing a fascinating thing. The holly oaks here, I'm going to show a little phylogeny, because they had evolved in Southeast Asia and moved along the Himalayas over to Western Europe in time to meet the white oaks who were coming in from Eastern North America. So, but how did the white oaks do it? We think they may have had gene flow on their side. Remember Berger's idea that every species is evolving in its own niche, but sharing advances ecologically with its relatives by gene flow. When the eastern white oak relatives that got over to Eurasia arrived, they met Quercus pontica, a Eurasian species of which we have very little fossil record. It's an upland species. These mostly don't preserve well. But they exchanged genes with Quercus pontica. And all these pre-adapted genes of Quercus pontica are found in the Eurasian white oaks today and may have been key to their success. And in fact, the white oaks went on to cover Eurasia, so that when you look at these giant white oaks, this is a Quercus petrea in a northern French forest, and you think about the wine barrels that you're getting, the good French wines, these are really Eastern North American descendants that thrived when they hit Eurasia. The combination of gene flow and their adaptation to drought, freezing, disease resistance, and a little bit of good luck made white oaks a global success. Almost anywhere in the world where you find oaks, you find white oaks, with a notable exception, Southeast Asia. Way down here only has ring-cupped oaks. Okay, now that's the north. We have one last exciting story, because at the southern edge of the continent, as the oaks are going over to Eurasia, oaks were moving from eastern North America once again into Mexico. There are about 160 oak species in Mexico today. This might be a slight overestimate. It's based on our current taxonomy, but even so, there's a ton of them. And the radiation in Mexico is enormously important ecologically, economically. They're the largest Mexican woody plant genus in both biomass and species richness. As they moved from eastern North America down into Mexico, oaks climbed up into the mountains. And as they did so, the lobed oaks that we think of as typical of eastern North America gave way to unlobed descendants, adapting to new climates and new soils. So again, we're going to take a look at a phylogeny. Don't have to worry about the details of these tips, but look at the dates here. We've used some of our genomic data combined with fossils to ask when oaks moved into Mexico. And what we find is that in both the white oaks and the red oaks, they move into Mexico in what looks like the Miocene, which is an exciting thing because this roughly correlates with the time when the grassland and deserts are spreading, severing eastern North America from Mexico, which may explain how we got this Mexican oak clade. And what path did they take? When you look in Mexico, this gray area on the map, this is the pine oak woodland. If you have a chance to get into this area, you'll be struck at how you move from the tropics up in the mountains. You feel like you're moving into the temperate zone when you get into these mountains. So we asked the question of how oaks moved through Mexico, and this is a paper that's just being written up right now, so I'm not going to show detailed analysis, but just sort of a cartoon of the story. And the story in both the red oaks and the white oaks is that as they moved from eastern North America, the oaks left a group of species in northeastern Mexico and Texas. They're sort of the gateway into the neotropics. They each then sent a lineage down into Central America, sort of limited radiation in Central America. And they both moved back up the western mountains, so that when you go to Arizona, if you've been to the Sky Islands, the Chiricahuas, the Pinolinos in Arizona, those species that you find are really young ones. They're descendants of the Mexican oaks. So when we look at the tree of life here, and we see this division into the old world oaks, the ring-cupped oaks, the holly oaks, and the turkey oaks, and the division into and the division of the new world oaks, the red oaks, the white oaks, the golden cupped or intermediate oaks, the southern live oaks. We're seeing this classification that really tracks the tree of life. So here you're looking at the last phylogeny you'll see tonight, where the New World oaks and the Old World oaks are each a subgenus, and each section is a lineage. So when you use these taxonomic names, you're really reconstructing the tree of life with your language. It's kind of exciting. And this tree of life really shapes the global distribution of oaks, which is shaped in turn by the tree of life, which in turn shapes the tree of life. And so this really brings the whole thing full circle. The tree of life churns out species. These in turn form the next branches of the tree of life. Species interact in communities as individuals, and those selective or evolutionary processes in those forests, those produce the species that we know today. And so oaks as a lineage really exhibit a remarkable capacity to evolve in response to climate change. They may well outlive us, but we're driving climates up at a ferocious rate right now, right? Individual species may not be as nimble as the lineage as a whole. 31% of oaks worldwide are threatened with extinction due to climate, due to pests, due to habitat loss. And what's going to be the outcome of all of this? It may well be that for some species, gene flow between species will be their last hope. Just as Neanderthals and Denisovans exchanged genes with modern humans, and those genes escaped into us, so that we all have about 3% of our genome is Neanderthal now. In the same way, oak genes have done likewise and will continue to do so. So this whole story of oak evolutionary history and oak ecology, this is what's told in the book. You look at the QR code down here. This will take you to the University of Chicago Press. That's the site that's the publisher for this book. Right now, if you go there, you may find that the book is back ordered. Their first print run immediately disappeared into stores and Amazon. You can still find the book available right now on Amazon, or you can pre-order it through your local bookstore or through the University of Chicago Press. As you read it, you will see lots and lots of names, because this work is not possible without a huge amount of collaboration. Collaborators whom I first started working with on understanding the American oaks, and as our group grew and grew to understanding the global oaks. My collaborators, especially in Mexico, where we've been working for roughly a decade to understand diversification of the Mexican oak species. My lab group, volunteers, students, employees who have helped us with our experimental work and make this work a joy. Collaborators in China, and the folks I work with every day. And thank you all for being here. I apologize, it looks like I ran a minute over time. I really appreciate your taking the time to come together and think about and talk about oaks for an hour this evening. This stuff is a real joy to me, and I appreciate your time. So thank you, and I'll stay on and answer questions.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, once again for doing a great presentation. And this was part of our ongoing monthly webinars for TIES, the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. And TIES is just one program for K through 12 educators. We have a website, which is tieseducation.org. We are very active on Facebook, and we also have an active YouTube channel. All of our past webinars are posted there. And I have created playlists. So if you are teaching human evolution, natural selection, you can go to those playlists and use them as a free resource. If you go to our website, you will see that we have full units to teach evolution. We also have them in Spanish. We also have them available if you have to do remote learning in the case of a pandemic. And then if you go to our website, you'll see that all of our resources are for free. Most of them are in a editable format. So almost everything is in Word or PowerPoint, because we want you to make it your own. We want you to add your name to it, edit it, because you know your students the best. All of our resources are free, except for our book on teaching evolution, because we had to pay the publisher to print the book. But right now we are having a BOGO sale, buy one, get one free. It makes the perfect holiday present. So if you go to our website, tieseducation.org, you will see that our book is BOGO, right? Another program that we do is Science Saves. Science Saves is a non-bipartisan effort to promote science appreciation. TIES is mostly for through 12 science classes, but Science Saves covers all of the different core curriculum. And just like TIES, we have the lessons pre-written out, just in case you have to submit them to your principal. Another part of Science Saves is that we have a National Science Appreciation Day campaign. We want March 26th to be the National Science Appreciation Day to celebrate Jonas Salk vaccination for polio. And as of today, we have 22 states who have signed on. We have 22 state governors who have signed across the US designating March 26th. So if you go to our website, you will see if your state is participating, and if they are not, we have a easy Google sheet that you can fill in, and we will send it on your behalf to request that we celebrate science. And the last program I'm going to briefly talk about is Generation Skeptics. We want to have skeptical thinkers, we want to have critical thinkers, and we have K through 12 resources to teach skeptical thinking. Here are just two examples out of dozens that we have on our website. The one for how to sell pseudoscience, it's great because once people and students realize how hucksters and tricksters use those skills, they will be inoculated when they go out in the real world. So they will recognize how people are selling misinformation, and they will have healthy skepticism. And everything is free. All right. Thank you, Andrew, for that brief commercial. All right. The first one I'll read is from Paul. Assuming that climate change is producing more erratic swings in weather conditions from year to year in many places where oak grow, how might more volatility in climate conditions affect the patterns of masting cycles in oaks?
That's a great question. I I would hesitate to guess too much. My expectation is that we would still see um, that we would still continue to see intense masting. Um, my bigger concern is not with masting and reproduction so much. My bigger concern is with what what those swings that we're seeing in our area at least are contributing to root rot in oaks and oak so higher oak mortality. In our area, we're seeing the cool, wet springs combined with more frequent summer droughts are leading to higher incidence of root rot and then susceptibility to root rot. So that concerns me more than masting per se. The other thing is that we see seedlings and many people across, this is widespread in many areas of the Americas, at least, that we're seeing sort of mesification of our forests, such that the oak-dominated forests, you look around, you see all these big old oaks, and after a mast year, like that photo I showed you of the Eastern North American white oak, where the seedlings are all over the floor. What you didn't see is if I looked around, there's not a single white oak sapling in there. Not one that I can find. That means there's a difference between the white oak seedlings and the adult oaks of about 120, 150 years without recruitment of those seedlings into the sapling layer. We think it has to do with light in part and change of light environments and also with herbivory. So those things concern me more than the masting per se. So that's my guess. I mean, that's totally off the cuff.
Okay. I was trying to correlate the questions so they are thematic, but it is proving to be harder than I thought. Okay, so I'm just going to go down the line. Reed asked, is there a native Illinois, Indiana, smaller oak shrub or smaller tree that I can plant to support the species or environment? But maybe, Andrew, a more appropriate question, because we are a national organization, is what are some resources to go to find a native oak that is good for your habitat? And then somebody else asked, and I'm going to summarize it, is what are your feelings about people planting non-native oaks in their ornamental backyards?
Okay, okay. A few great questions there. So there are shrub oaks I will answer the first question just because I'm a Midwesterner.
Yeah.
Quercus prinoides is the shrub. I'll say it's the shrub form of what we call chinkapin oak. It's unclear whether it's a separate species. It might be, it might not be, but certainly there are shrub forms of Quercus Prinoides / Quercus that are worth looking at. And in the Northeast, you've got Quercus ilicifolia. There are shrub oaks in many areas of the country. And now to know the species of your area, most places have a botanical garden nearby with good resources. So I work at the Morton Arboretum. It's a public garden. We have a plant clinic that you can go on our website, mortonarb.org, and look up plants that might do well in your area with a strong focus on the plants of the Chicago region. There's going to be gardens, Missouri Botanical Garden. Michael Eason is here. He can plug his garden's website into the chat as well. I would reach out to your local experts, your local botanical gardens, local native plant societies to see what they recommend. But then the question about non-native oak species, I strongly recommend planting native oak species for two reasons. One is they are likely to be most beneficial to the local insect populations. Oaks are disproportionately important to fungi, insects, fungi, invertebrates, and vertebrates. They just provide so much habitat and food for all these groups of organisms. And the native species are most likely to be helpful. They're also likely to do well. However, many people live in urban areas, and urban areas are really harsh places, can be harsh places for trees to grow. In some cases, it's really beneficial to have trees that grow well along in a street tree environment. In that case, it might be sensible to use non-native species. So I'm not adamantly opposed to them. I favor native species when it's possible for people to plant them because of the opportunity for higher ecological benefits.
Okay. Okay, there's a question about hybridization. Why are oaks prone to hybridization? And then Georgia mentioned some other species of trees, but I'm really into carnivorous plants and Sarracenia, the northern pitcher plant. They are promiscuous. They will have sex with any plant around them. And then somebody else asked about heterosis, about hybrid vigor.
Okay, all great questions. So we don't have a very clear answer as to why oaks are particularly why they're particularly given to hybridization. They do have fairly consistent. They outcross, right? So they have to outcross, and it may well be that there's been selection favoring a low level of hybridization to maintain genetic diversity. That's a possibility, but that's merely a hypothesis. Their genomes are fairly consistent, which means that you can line the genes up across the oak genus, and in fact, across the oak family. And at very large scales, you tend to find them similar. That means that if you get pollen from one species landing on the female flower of another, and then it gets down there and successfully fertilizes, that you're less likely to see it sort of a train wreck at meiosis. Not completely impossible, but you're less likely to have that problem. Now, the outcomes of hybridization, though, I think it was thought for a while that oaks were completely promiscuous. In fact, there is reproductive isolation between oaks to a certain extent. So that in general, if you have pollen competing, right, you get pollen from multiple species competing on a single stigma, all those little pollen tubes are racing to get down to the ovules. And they go through the typically the ones that win the race are pollen grains from other members of the same species. The second in the race is pollen grains from close relatives, different species, close relatives. So those are potentially hybrids. And the losers in these races are usually the pollen from the same tree. So you get some acorns that are self-pollinated, but they don't do well. So there's reproductive isolation at the level of sort of who's germinating effectively, what pollen tubes are growing well, and then once they germinate, those acorns sometimes are less fit if they're hybrid, right? So you get all these levels of opportunities to weed out hybridization. But then once you get a hybrid produced, that F1 hybrid, that first generation hybrid between a white oak and a swamp white oak, or a bur oak and a swamp white oak, even more commonly, those first generation hybrids are generally morphologically, ecologically intermediate. So they may or may not have a good home in the habitat where they're produced. But if they do, then they are likelier to back cross to mom or dad. And so that first generation hybrid will tend to shed acorns that are back cross to mom or dad, more like mom or dad than the other. And those acorns that give rise are more likely to be similar to the same parent who is dominant in the site. And that's the process by which we get genes moving from one species to another.
Okay, and you have lots of thank yous and congratulations and fascinating talks, and they really appreciated it. And maybe just one or two more questions. George asks, can you please talk and explain why are some oaks trees and why are some shrub oaks and why are some shrubs?
What a wonderful question. If it looks like I'm distracted, I'm just typing my email into the chat because I know we're going to get cut off in a little bit. If there are follow-up questions that I don't get to, please feel free to email me. Why are there trees? Why are there shrubs? It's because oaks have been able to adapt to different environments, and different environments have favored oaks or shrubs. I showed that Quercus striatula, Quercus microphylla. There's all these little shrubby species, and I've seen some growing just this tall in areas of Mexico. I know that both Adam Black and Michael Eason are on this call. I know that they've thought critically about the really shrubby white oaks. In California, you get shrubby white oaks. In Texas, you get shrubby white oaks. They're adapted to the drier environments and the lower competition that you find in those environments. But that's not the only reason that you find shrubby oaks. So for instance, in the mountains of eastern North America, you can find Quercus marylandica, right? Quercus coccinea growing as trees. That's blackjack oak and scarlet oak. And below them, you find shrubby little bare oak, Quercus ilicifolia. So it's just found a place to grow there. So I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer. I guess I would just say that oaks have wormed their way into a variety of different ecological conditions, and it's been their ability to do that that is part of the reason for their success. There's like 425 species worldwide. They're the highest biomass, highest species diversity of woody plant genera in North America and in Mexico. And it's partly that ecological lability that's allowed them to do that. So that's my long-winded answer, which is I don't know.
That's okay. I think this literally happens in every webinar. You get the audience learns some science, and then there's so many more questions.
Right.
Okay, so the last question we're going to take is from Amanda. What is known of the mechanism used by oaks to incorporate regional genetics, yet to keep the morphological characteristics unique to the species?
Right. So I'm reminded of a really neat study in a lot of these cool studies dissecting these evolutionary processes at the species level are in the European oaks, partly because they've been working at it for a long time, but partly because their system is comparatively simple, where they've got a few species to wrestle with. But there's a great study in one forest in France by a scientist named Alexandre, Alexandre, I think, is the last name. And what they did is they looked at selection, natural selection for those attributes that define pedunculate oak versus sessile oak. I am going to answer this question. And so what happened, what they found is that in each generation, what was positively selected was those individuals that are distinctly one species or the other. So natural selection was selecting for those attributes that we recognize as being the species. What was coming along with those attributes is whole swaths of the genome that define species A versus species B. So natural selection is favoring these individuals that we recognize as being one species or the other. Whereas individuals that are intermediate appear to be less favored by natural selection, at least in that system. My suspicion is that if we could go around and answer this at lots and lots of different species, in lots and lots of different species combinations, we'd find that that was a general, if not universal, it was a common answer. Does that make sense?
We will accept that answer.
Oh,
Yes.
that's awfully nice of you. If people have follow-up questions, don't hesitate to write me. These are things I'm really excited about, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, everyone who attended this webinar live, and thank you so much, Andrew. And there was a couple of questions about where they can find the recording of this, and all of our webinars are on our YouTube page, which is Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. And with that, we hope you follow us to get our 2025 webinar schedule. And thank you, Andrew, and everyone else. Have a great end of the year.